I thought my husband was at work when I got the call. I thought the worst thing about my Wednesday was the broken coffee maker and the pile of unread emails waiting on my desk. I had no idea that while I was standing in my own kitchen, muttering at the reset button on the machine, my mother-in-law was already in the hallway of our building. Our building. Telling our neighbor with a wide, triumphant smile that the apartment was finally going to be properly taken care of. I didn't know yet that she had arranged to have the locks changed. I didn't know that she'd been planning this for the better part of a year. She had mapped it all out with the kind of precision that, when I finally understood the full shape of it, made my skin go cold. Every Sunday dinner, every carefully casual question about the terms of my lease, every time she'd asked to borrow a copy of our apartment keys, just for emergencies, she said, just in case. It had all been pieces of a strategy so deliberate and so patient that I still lose my breath when I think about how completely I failed to see it coming. And the worst part, the part that took me the longest to accept, the part that still wakes me up some nights with a tightness in my chest that doesn't ease until I sit up and remind myself it's over. My husband knew. He had known almost from the beginning. My name is Clara. I am 34 years old, and until approximately 8 months ago, I had what most people would call a good, solid life. Not spectacular. I wasn't going on vacations to places I'd seen in magazines, but it was mine, built by me from nothing, piece by careful piece. I had a job I was proud of, a small but genuinely beautiful apartment on the 4th floor of a building in the West End of the city, and a marriage, I believed, with the sincere conviction of someone who has always worked hard for the things she has, was built on something lasting. The apartment was the thing I loved most. I'd found it 6 years ago, before I'd ever met Marcus, when I was 28 and fresh out of a long, exhausting relationship that had left me feeling like I'd been living inside someone else's life. I'd spent 2 years saving for the deposit, packing my own lunches, working extra hours, saying no to things I wanted. And when the day finally came and I turned the key in the lock for the first time, I stood in the empty living room and cried from the pure, clean relief of having done it. My friend Diane had helped me move in on a hot July afternoon, the two of us hauling boxes up 4 flights of stairs, sweating and laughing, stopping on the second landing to drink warm water from a plastic bottle. When we finally got the bookcase against the wall, she stepped back and said, "This is perfect, Clara. This is so you." She was right. I painted the kitchen walls a deep, warm yellow, the color of September afternoon light, hung shelves, filled them with books, put a reading lamp in the corner by the window, and on winter evenings I would sit there with a glass of wine and the rain against the glass and feel, quietly and completely, like myself. When Marcus came into my life 3 years later, I wasn't looking for anyone. We met at a work event. He was a friend of a colleague, tall and easygoing and slightly rumpled in a way that suggested he'd been thinking about something interesting before you interrupted him. He made me laugh 3 times in the first 20 minutes. I was careful with him at first, the way I'd learned to be careful, but he was patient and steady, and after 6 months I let myself trust it. He moved in on a Sunday in late spring, bringing a coffee machine that was genuinely better than mine, a collection of paperback thrillers with broken spines, and an unfortunate fondness for motivational throw pillows that I quietly relocated to the top shelf of the wardrobe. We married a year later. City Hall, Diane and Marcus's college friend Rob as witnesses, lunch at a restaurant we both loved. Simple. Exactly as we wanted. Not what Eleanor had wanted. Eleanor had envisioned something else entirely. A church, a reception hall, 100 guests, a cake with multiple tiers. When I said gently that we preferred something small, she'd accepted it with a smile that contained something underneath it. Not quite displeasure, more like the careful filing away of information. At the wedding lunch, looking at photos on Diane's phone, she kissed my cheek and said, "Well, at least you're married." Pleasant, harmless. The kind of sentence that lodges somewhere in the back of your mind and stays there like a splinter you can't quite reach. I told myself I was being oversensitive. I told myself she was from a different generation. I told myself many generous things about Eleanor over the years, almost none of them accurate. Eleanor was a compact woman in her early 60s, with silver hair in a precise chignon and a wardrobe of neutrals, beige, taupe, ivory, as though she'd decided to make herself difficult to accuse of anything. She had warm brown eyes that could harden without warning, and she used that contrast expertly. She was never overtly cruel, not in the early years, which was what made her so difficult to argue against. Every criticism came wrapped in such genuine seeming concern that you almost believed her. She would say my hair looked tired in the same gentle tone she used to offer more cake. She would comment at every dinner on whether Marcus was eating enough, sleeping properly, as though my presence in his life were a nutritional concern rather than anything positive. Her house always smelled of lavender, and I have never been able to stand the smell of lavender since. The apartment questions had started almost immediately. The week after Marcus and I moved in together, Eleanor mentioned at Sunday dinner that she supposed we were comfortable enough, though she didn't understand why a married couple would rent rather than own. A month later, she asked whose name was on the lease. Then, had I thought about adding Marcus? Then, what would happen to him if I were ever unavailable? The questions were always spaced out, always gentle, always framed as concern. I answered them honestly every time because I had nothing to hide. The lease was in my name. I paid the rent. Marcus contributed to household expenses, but the apartment legally was mine. The first time I felt the ground genuinely shift was on a Sunday in early February, 5 months before everything came apart. Marcus had gone to watch the match after lunch, and Eleanor had kept me in the kitchen to dry the good china, which she never trusted to the dishwasher. The kitchen smelled of lavender and dish soap. Without looking up from the sink, she said quietly that she'd been thinking about arrangements. In case anything happened to me, she said, in case I were ever in any kind of trouble. She said it would be simple enough to arrange a lease transfer or a dual tenancy. She said Marcus could handle the paperwork. She said she could help him. I set the plate I was drying carefully on the rack. "I'm not planning to be in trouble," I said. She looked at me then, her expression entirely serene. "Of course not, darling," she said. "But it's wise to plan. Life is unpredictable." She pulled the plug, dried her hands on a separate towel, smiled, and the conversation was over as cleanly as if she'd turned off a switch. In the car afterward, I told Marcus exactly what she'd said. He was quiet for too long, his hands on the wheel, and then he said, "You know how she worries," in a voice that was soft and practiced in a way I hadn't noticed before. That night I lay awake at 2 a.m. while the city made its quiet sounds outside, and I thought about the words she had used. She'd said we should talk about arrangements. Not you. We. The night was long, and I was tired, and eventually I slept. And in the morning, I convinced myself I'd read too much into it. Diane called the next day. I told her about the kitchen conversation, about the months of questions. She was quiet in that way she has when she's thinking something through, and when she spoke, she said, "Clara, have you actually read your lease recently? Like, looked at the physical document?" I said I didn't need to. I knew what was in it. She said, "Check it." I told her she was being paranoid. She said she might be, but to check anyway. I said I would. I didn't. I have thought about that many times since. The particular cost of the moments when we don't listen to the people who love us. In March, Marcus started taking his phone calls in the bedroom with the door closed. Just some calls, not all. And at first, I barely registered it, because I was busy and the closed door seemed like such a small thing. But I began to notice that the calls always happened in the early evenings, and that when he came out of the bedroom afterward, he was always slightly too casual, too bright, the way people are when they're trying very hard not to be anything in particular. Once I stood outside the bedroom door and heard him say, low and careful, Not yet. It's not the right time. She's gonna notice. And then a pause I couldn't fill. I knocked before entering. By the time I opened the door, the phone was on the bed and his eyes were on the laptop. "Dinner," I said. "Starving," he said, and followed me to the kitchen and asked about my day as though the conversation I'd half heard had never happened, which was the most frightening part. I didn't ask about the call. I know why I didn't. I was afraid of what he might say, and I still loved him. Love is sometimes a very effective blindfold. In early April, I came home to find my keys slightly out of place on the hook by the door. I keep them on the third hook from the left. I have since I moved in. And that evening, they were on the second hook. I held them for a moment, told myself I'd hung them wrong, put them on the third hook, made dinner, did not think about it again. It was a Wednesday in late April when everything finally broke open. Marcus had left at his normal time. 7:45, coffee in a travel mug, quick kiss at the door, the sound of his footsteps on the stairs fading to the street below, and I had settled at the kitchen table with my laptop and tea, working from home as I did on Wednesdays. The spring light came through the window in long, warm slants. The kitchen was quiet and yellow and completely, cruelly ordinary. I was focused on a work report and entirely unprepared for what was coming. My phone rang at 10:40. Unknown number. I answered because I was expecting a call from a client. The man said his name was Gary and that he was calling from the property management office of our building and that he was calling to follow up on a change of tenancy requests submitted the previous week. He needed to confirm some details with the primary leaseholder, with Clara. I said that was me. He paused. "You did submit the request, didn't you?" he said carefully, "to remove yourself from the lease and transfer the primary tenancy to Marcus Whitfield and Eleanor Whitfield jointly?" Everything in the kitchen went still, not spinning, still. The refrigerator hummed. The tea sat cooling beside the laptop. I was aware, with the strange precision of shock, of the texture of the chair under my hands, the quality of the light, the sound of a bus on the street below. And I thought, with a clarity that felt almost physical, last Thursday. I had come home late, tired, and dropped my bag in the hallway, and Marcus had picked it up and carried it to the bedroom for me. He'd been so thoughtful. I'd kissed him on the cheek, and he had smiled and looked slightly away, as he had been doing for weeks. He'd had my bag for 5 minutes. My keys had been in it. "Can you email me a copy of that form?" I said. My voice was flat and steady, belonging to someone calm. He said he could. He was apologetic, kind. Said these things sometimes happened, miscommunications, easily sorted. I thanked him and hung up and sat and looked at my cold tea. The email arrived 6 minutes later. I opened the PDF. 2 pages, my name printed clearly on the first. On the signature line of the second page was a signature that was almost mine. Almost. The loop on the capital C was slightly too wide. The tail on the L didn't connect the way mine always does. I have had the same signature since I was 17, practiced it in the margins of my school notebooks, and I know every line of it. This wasn't it. My signature had been forged. I sat with that for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. The light on the yellow wall looked ordinary and terrible. I thought about Eleanor's voice at the kitchen sink. I think we should talk about the practical side of things. I thought about Marcus through the bedroom door. Not yet. She's going to notice. I thought about my keys on the wrong hook. I stood up slowly. I walked to the study. I opened the filing cabinet. I found the plastic sleeve where I kept the lease. I unfolded it, and behind the original document, behind the lease I'd signed 6 years ago with a pen that kept running out of ink, there was a second document I had never seen before, a transfer agreement, 3 pages, drafted on the letterhead of a property solicitor I didn't recognize, signed by Marcus, signed by Eleanor. And at the bottom of the second page, a better forgery than the form Gary had sent, more careful, more polished, notarized, dated 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago, my husband and his mother had signed legal documents to transfer the lease of my apartment to themselves. They had forged my signature. They had had it notarized. This was not impulsive. This was not opportunistic. This had been planned, carefully, over months, by two people who sat at my dinner table every week and smiled and passed the potatoes. I set the document down on the desk. The room was very quiet. I could hear my own breathing, slow and deliberate, as though my body had decided to stay calm even if the rest of me hadn't caught up yet. I thought about every question Eleanor had asked about the lease. I thought about every Sunday dinner, every kitchen conversation, every smooth answer Marcus had given when I'd expressed my doubts. I thought about the warm weight of my keys in the hand of a man I had trusted completely. She wasn't worried about Marcus being left with nothing. She had wanted to remove me. And my husband, the man I had kissed goodbye that morning, the man whose coffee machine was better than mine, the man I had built a home with, had helped her do it. I picked up my phone and called Diane. My voice, when she answered, was very quiet and very clear. "You need to come over right now," I said, "and bring the name of a solicitor." There was a pause on her end, and I could hear everything she wasn't saying, and then she said, "I'm getting my coat." Diane arrived in 40 minutes. She knocked twice. Our old signal, the same one we'd used since university. And when I opened the door, she looked at my face and came in without a word, put her coat over the back of a chair and sat at the kitchen table with the calm of someone who has decided to be useful. I had made fresh tea and laid out the documents in a row: the original lease, the transfer agreement, the forged form Gary had emailed, printed on 2 sheets. Diane looked at them without touching them for a long moment, the way you look at something that might bite. "How long?" she said. "The agreement is dated 6 weeks ago," I said, "but the question started before we were even married." She looked up at me. "Marcus signed this." "Yes." "He signed it, had it notarized, put it in your filing cabinet, and said nothing." "Yes." She sat back. Outside, a pigeon was walking along the balcony railing with that self-important air they have, and for a moment we both watched it, and the kitchen was very quiet. Then Diane said, "Right," in the tone that means she has sorted herself out and is ready to be useful, and she picked up her phone. "My colleague's husband is a property solicitor. His name is Andrew Marsh. I'm calling him now." Andrew had a cancellation that afternoon. 40 minutes later, we were in his office, the documents in a folder on my lap. He read everything carefully and without expression, then looked at me over his glasses. "The notarization is the interesting part," he said. "Either someone bribed a notary or someone impersonated you in person. Either way, this is document fraud. Potentially conspiracy, depending on how many parties were involved in planning it." He paused. "You said your husband signed this voluntarily." "He signed it," I said. "I don't know what he understood it to be." Andrew looked at me with the mild, patient expression of a man who has seen many people extend their spouses excessive benefit of the doubt. He didn't comment. He made calls. He spoke to the property management office and informed them the request was fraudulent and no changes were to be made pending legal review. Then he told me I had 2 immediate priorities: secure the apartment and speak to Marcus before he had any chance to coordinate a story with Eleanor. "Tonight," he said, "before he knows you know." Marcus was already home when I arrived, making pasta. He cooked on Wednesdays, a habit from years ago. And the kitchen smelled of garlic and olive oil, and the radio played something low. He looked up when I came in with the expression of a man who has no idea the world is about to change. "Hey," he said, 20 minutes. I put the folder on the table and sat down. He looked at it. Something moved across his face, fast, there and gone, and his expression rearranged itself into mild curiosity. "What's that?" "Sit down, Marcus." He sat. I pushed the transfer agreement across the table to him. He looked at it, and his face did something complicated, a sequence of expressions too rapid to read fully, but which included, unmistakably, the look of someone who recognizes something they had hoped never to see. His hand stayed flat on the table. He didn't pick it up. "Where did you get this?" he said. "The building management office called me today," I said, "to confirm the tenancy change request. I then found this in my own filing cabinet behind our original lease. Marcus." I kept my voice quiet and completely level, and I think the levelness frightened him more than shouting would have. "Your name is on this document. Tell me what you understood it to be when you signed it." He didn't answer for a long time. He looked at the table, not at me, and the silence stretched long enough that I could hear the sauce beginning to bubble on the stove. "She said it was a formality," he said finally, "a safeguard, in case something happened. She said I'd agreed to it." He nodded, barely perceptibly. "She said you'd talked about it, that you both thought it was sensible." "I never agreed to it," I said. "You were in that car when I told you what she said in her kitchen. You heard every conversation I described, and you signed a document to remove me from my own lease." I stood up. "I've spoken to a solicitor. The management office has been notified. No changes will be made. You need to understand that your mother committed document fraud, and you were a party to it. I need you to call her, tell her I know, and then I need you to not be here tonight." He looked at me with an expression made of shame and grief and something else. Relief, I thought, and the thought landed like its own small, cold shock. Then he nodded and went to the bedroom and closed the door, and I turned off the stove, and I stood in my yellow kitchen and listened to his low, urgent voice speaking to his mother through the wall, and I thought, she already knows I know. She's been waiting for this call. I was right. Eleanor called me herself 20 minutes after Marcus left with a bag. Her voice was warm, concerned, as though she were calling to check on a cold. "I understand you've had a frightening day. Nothing was meant to upset you. Everything was meant to protect Marcus." "You forged my signature on a legal document," I said. A brief, controlled pause. "That's a very serious accusation. It's a very accurate description." "All the correct procedures were followed," she said, and the warmth had a faint sharpening at the edges now, something harder pressing through. "If there was any confusion about your consent, that can be discussed like adults." "Consent isn't confusion," I said. "You forged my signature. I never saw that document. I never spoke to your solicitor, and neither did the notary who apparently witnessed my signature, because I was in this apartment when it was signed, not in any solicitor's office. My solicitor is currently investigating who impersonated me and how." Silence. Longer this time. When she spoke again, the warmth was entirely gone. "You have no idea what you're doing," she said. "I think I do." "Marcus is my son," she said, and her voice was cold and direct and old in a way I hadn't heard before. "You came into his life with your lease and your little lamp in the corner and your painted walls, and you've kept him in someone else's home for years. I am protecting my son." "From what?" I said. She didn't answer. The silence was its own answer. She had decided long before this that I was the wrong fit, too independent, too attached to my own foundation, too unwilling to fold myself into the shape she'd designed for her son's life. The lease in my name had been proof that I existed separately from Marcus, and that, I understood now with total clarity, was what she had never been able to tolerate. "I want you to drop this," she said quietly. "Speak to your solicitor. Say there was a misunderstanding. Withdraw whatever you've filed." "No," I said, flat, final, nothing underneath it she could grab onto. "Clara." "No," I said again, exactly the same way. "We're done talking tonight." I hung up. I sat in the quiet of my apartment, and the lamp in the corner threw its warm light across the shelves, and the rain had started against the glass. I thought about what she'd said, "Your little lamp in the corner." She had noticed the lamp. She had understood exactly what it meant and hated it for that reason. I felt a grief that was separate from the betrayal, a grief for the version of my marriage I had believed in, for the home I had shared without guarding. That version was gone. But the apartment was not gone. Not yet. Andrew called the next morning with something that changed the picture entirely. Through the management office, he had discovered that a representative from Eleanor's household had visited their office 3 weeks prior, not to submit the request form, but to ask questions about forced tenancy transfers, about the grounds required, about what happened to a lease if the primary tenant were convicted of a criminal offense, about whether a conviction automatically terminated a tenancy. I went very still. She was researching what would happen to the lease if I were imprisoned, I said. That's what the records indicate, Andrew said carefully. The plan, when I grasped its full shape, was more sophisticated than I had imagined. The forged transfer was one track, fast, hoping I wouldn't notice. But Eleanor had been building a second track in parallel. Over the following weeks, I would learn about the complaint she had filed with my employer, alleging financial misconduct. I would learn about an anonymous letter sent to the tax authorities suggesting I had underreported income from a freelance arrangement I had never had. Each discovery landed separately, like blows spaced to be maximally disorienting. Eleanor had not been improvising. She'd been constructing a narrative, a story in which I was dishonest, unstable, and removable by legal means, to run alongside the forgery. She'd been building this, methodically, since before the winter. Marcus came to the apartment on the Saturday and told me everything. He told me Eleanor had come to him in January, had presented the transfer as protective, had told him I had mentioned wanting to formalize the tenancy and simply hadn't gotten around to it. He said he had believed her. He said that when the notarized agreement came back and he'd seen the signature, my signature, which he knew, he had known it wasn't right, and he had said nothing. He had put it in the filing cabinet and closed the drawer and made pasta on Wednesdays and said nothing for 6 weeks. I kept thinking she wouldn't actually do anything with it, he said. She filed a complaint with my employer, I said, alleging financial misconduct. He went white. There's also a letter to the tax authority. I didn't know, he whispered. I didn't write any of that. Then there's a version of this where you were manipulated and made a terrible choice, I said quietly. And another version where you were complicit in something much larger and chose not to look at it. I don't know yet which is true. I'm not certain you do either. He didn't answer. There wasn't anything to say. The confrontation with Eleanor happened 2 weeks later. Not explosive, as I'd imagined, but quieter, more final. Patricia, my second solicitor, attended with me. Marcus came, which Eleanor had not expected, and he stood in the corner of her beige living room and looked at the floor. She opened the door, saw the three of us, said, "I see," and stepped back to let us in. The response of a woman who had known this moment was possible and had prepared herself to face it standing up. She offered tea. Patricia said no. Eleanor sat in her armchair with her hands folded, silver hair in place, and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before. Stripped of warmth, stripped of calculation, bare and very tired. The most honest I had ever seen her be. Patricia laid out the evidence. The forged agreement, Jeffrey's statement, Eleanor's second cousin, the retired notary who had stamped the document without ever seeing me sign it, the management office records, the employer complaint, the tax letter. Eleanor listened without interrupting. When Patricia finished, she said, "I did what I thought was right for my son." "You tried to take my home," I said. "When that wasn't going to be enough, you tried to destroy my career and my finances to have me removed by other means. I want you to understand that I know the full extent of it." She looked at me for a long moment. "You are very hard," she said. "I learned it from watching you," I said. The legal process took 4 months. Jeffrey's cooperation simplified it significantly. The fraud charges moved through the civil courts. Patricia's recommendation, faster and more certain. And the transfer agreement was formally voided. The management office confirmed the tenancy in my name. The employer complaint was withdrawn under legal pressure. The tax authority matter was resolved when I provided my financial records, which were, as mine have always been, entirely in order. Eleanor was ordered to pay legal costs and damages, and the formal finding of fraud was attached to her name, like a shadow she couldn't step out of. Marcus and I separated in October, not in one conversation or one moment. It accumulated over weeks in the space where trust had been and was no longer. He was not a bad man. I want to be precise about that. He was a man who had been weak at a critical moment, who had chosen comfort over honesty, whose failure left a damage neither of us could fully repair. We parted without ugliness. He took his coffee machine and his thrillers and his motivational throw pillows, and I kept the apartment, and we signed the papers on a gray November morning, and that was that. I changed the locks the day Eleanor's fraud charges were filed, not after the judgment, not after the separation, but that same day, immediately. The locksmith handed me 2 bright new keys that had never been copied, never been borrowed, never left on any hook but mine. He asked if I was moving in or moving out. Moving in, I said. He nodded and left. I locked and unlocked the door 3 times just to feel it. Spring came, the way it always does. I repainted the kitchen walls, the same yellow, the exact same shade, because I liked the yellow and I was not going to give Eleanor that. I bought a small olive tree in a terracotta pot and put it on the balcony for the afternoon light. Diane came over on a Saturday and we sat on the balcony with coffee and the sounds of the city below, and she said, without preamble, "You look like yourself again." I thought about what it means to look like yourself, what it costs to lose that and what it costs to get it back. I thought about the 28-year-old who had cried in an empty room from the relief of having built something real. I thought about how I had let that clarity get obscured by the desire to keep the peace, by the impulse to be generous, by the particular blindness of a woman who loves someone and trusts him and does not want to look at the evidence that the trust is misplaced. I had made tolerance look like wisdom. I had watched the warning signs and chosen comfortable explanations. I had very nearly paid for that with everything. That was not going to happen again. Not with the apartment, not with a person, not with anything that mattered to me. That was not cynicism. It was clarity. The kind you earn by losing things you valued and that you carry afterward like a key you never leave in the wrong place. The olive tree put out new leaves in late April, small and silver gray, catching the light on a Tuesday morning while I stood in the doorway with my coffee. My apartment, my lease, my lamp in the corner throwing its warm circle across the books and the shelves and the life I had built and defended and chosen to keep. Some things, once you've fought for them, you simply do not let go.